I would like to acknowledge my student co-chair leaders, Aaron Smith and Loretta Taylor. And on behalf of the committee, we would like to thank student leaders that have organized brown bag panels this week, as well as faculty and staff that have been of great assistance in coordinating this week's events. We would also like to give a special thanks to Vanita Gupta for coming. This month would have marked Barbara Jordan's 80th birthday. The LBJ School is privileged to have had her as a professor for 17 years. And we are proud to host the 20th annual National Barbara Jordan Forum. It was started in 1996 after she passed by students to honor her legacy as a leader, policymaker, and educator. The committee chose this year's theme, A Common Destiny, Criminal Justice Reform, from a Barbara Jordan quote that reads, "A spirit of harmony can only survive if each of us remembers, when bitterness and self-interest seem to prevail, that we share a common destiny." People of color are disproportionately affected at all levels of the criminal justice system, displayed through overrepresentation in the school-to-prison pipeline, detention centers, police brutality, and lengthy sentencing. Even upon release, there are barriers to employment, housing, education, and so much more due to stigma. Criminal justice reform is without a doubt one of the most pressing civil rights issues of our time. Barbara Jordan's legacy is that of resilience. Her resilience aided her in overcoming barriers of race, gender, and in her latter years, physical disability. She was the first African-American woman to serve in Congress from the Deep South, and the first woman ever elected to the Texas Senate in 1966. Like Barbara Jordan, millions of Americans that encounter the criminal justice system are increasingly being left out of the American dream. This forum is an avenue to highlight our common destiny and the power of harmonious efforts in breaking down barriers for marginalized communities. This week has brought together scholars, advocates, policymakers, and community members working to reform the criminal justice system. We are proud of the conversations that have taken place around a diverse set of issues, and we hope that you will join us for tomorrow's panel on the criminalization of HIV, as well as our service event at Barbara Jordan Elementary on Friday. This evening, we are partnering with the Division of Diversity and Community Engagement to host Engendering the 40 Acres. For more details on the rest of the week's events, please note the posters around the room with the complete schedule, or you can visit the LBJ School website. It is our hope that this week inspires you to carry on the great legacy of Barbara Jordan in the quest for social justice, equity, and civil rights for all. Thank you for joining us, and at this time we invite you to enjoy your lunch. The formal program will begin in about 30 minutes. Thank you.
Please stand up. You met Brencia earlier, Brencia Berry. Aaron Smith. And Loretta Taylor, who has one of the best smiles I've ever seen. I also want to acknowledge Shirley Franklin. You saw her a little bit in this film, and Shirley is the former mayor of Atlanta, but I know her best as my colleague here at the LBJ School. She's a fellow and the Barbara Jordan visiting professor, and she's been with us for 3 years, and she's one of the nicest, strongest, funniest people, and just a real delight to work with. Shirley, you want to stand? And then I want to introduce Ed Dorn, and I told him I found out a little story about Ed, and I've known Ed ever since I've come to the LBJ School, and I didn't know this. So Ed Dorn is the professor at the LBJ School, former dean, and a former assistant secretary of defense. And I found out, Ed, you first met Barbara Jordan when you were in 9th grade. Is that right?
Yes,
yeah,
that's right.
That's right. She was.
It was a scary experience, especially.
She was a young lawyer and just starting to set up a practice in Houston, and she came to visit at the school, and you introduced her. So, you know, it's funny how things come around. I also want to acknowledge and recognize Yvonne Loya. She's the Executive Director for Community and External Relations, Division of Diversity and Community Engagement, and the Heman Sweat Symposium Program Chair. And tonight we're going to have a session on that, so please. And then I have to introduce a real character, and his name is Andrew Peacock. He's a former ambassador from Australia. He's on the LBJ School Advisory Council. He's joined us today, and he had a long and distinguished career in Australia and worked in public policy and public service. And after he gave up his ambassadorship to the U.S., he joined Boeing, and now he's on the LBJ board. And then we have a very special guest with us, Clennon King, director of the award-winning documentary, Passage to St. Augustine. And last night, we had a showing of that film downstairs in the Bass Lecture Hall. So I went at the beginning of the film, and I had to go over to the library for an event, and I came back, and things were just, the dialogue and the discussion was really good. So thank you for coming. And, you know, one of the things that's so wonderful about the LBJ School is the legacy not only of the professors like Barbara Jordan, but also of the alum. And I want to recognize some alums who are serving as captains. I've never heard of a captain of a table, but I guess we have captains of tables. And when I call your name, please stand up. I really think it's important people see the wonderful legacy we have at the school. Michael Abkowitz, 1980. Here is Michael. Paige Buckley, 1995. There's Paige. Andrew Feldman, 1980. Oh, there you are. Oh, 1982. We have a wrong date here. We got you earlier. Ann Howard, 1988. Ann. Ginger Lowry, 1985. Humberto Martinez, 1989. Kim McMath, 1989. There's Kim. Jane Nussbaum, 1991. Jane. And Mike Walsh, 1990. Where's Mike? Over there. Now, they're captains of the table because they were all students of Barbara Jordan. So if you want to hear stories about her as a professor here, talk to them. They had the privilege of working with her and learning from her. So today, we're all here to celebrate her life and her legacy, and all of you. And it's really important that you all came. We continue the dialogue that she so eloquently framed. Challenging biases, champion ethical behavior, and always keeping social issues in the spotlight. That's what she was about, and that's what we're hoping we're doing this week, and not just this week, always in terms of the LBJ School. There's a quotation here. She proved that black is beautiful before we knew what it meant. That was President Johnson. I thought that was a great quote. And Lady Bird Johnson also has something to say, and she led Texans in the mourning of Barbara Jordan at her death, and she said, "I feel a stabbing sense of loss at the passing of a good friend." So Barbara Jordan had a very close tie with the Johnsons and obviously a very close tie with the school. Everybody heard, and I'm going to repeat, she was first among first. She was the first African American elected to the Texas Senate after Reconstruction and after trying 2 times before, so she didn't give up. She was the first Southern black female elected to the United States House of Representatives. She served on the House Judiciary Committee, and those of you who know Congress, this is a very, very important committee. And she was there during the Watergate era when this was a conflict between the Congress and the president. And in that era, she eloquently framed the constitutional abuses of President Nixon. She was the voice. She was the first African-American woman to deliver a keynote address at the Democratic National Convention, and you heard a little bit of that in the film. And on her death, she became the first African-American woman to be buried in the Texas State Cemetery. And her connection to the LBJ School runs very deep. First, she enjoyed a very special relationship with President Johnson. He mentored her, and he saw her as a powerful political leader. He supported her. Second, she spent the last years of her life from 1979 to 1996 as a distinguished professor here at the LBJ School, touching scores of students' lives. I was in an office when I first came here. I was in an office, and there were a couple boxes in this office, and they were her boxes. I was like, I couldn't believe that they were right there, and just a connection with her handwritten notes. It was a wonderful experience. Her students knew her as a rigorous mentor and a dedicated professor. And here are some quotes. Professor Jordan makes you look at your soul. I've never met a person who believes so strongly that we can actually change the world. That view makes me feel confidence that I really can. Those are just a couple. There's so many quotes about her. She defined what it meant to be true and ethical public servant for a generation of students, and her legacy and teachings live on in the LBJ School, and most obviously today as we partake in this forum, and we see so many students here and so many alum here. In her own words, this is what she said: I have seen in the LBJ School idealism, which I have not witnessed in nearly 2 decades. Now remember, 2 decades before she was in the Congress. Not idealism of the sort which results in self-emulation, but idealism tempered by reality. Similarly, I have had the unmitigated and regenerative pleasure of being with bright, hardworking students whose concerns extend beyond their own beings. This really does describe our student body here. Professor Jordan not only left a lasting, indelible impression on the students whom she taught and mentored, but also on her faculty colleagues who still look at her as an exemplar of ethics and public service. One such faculty member, and I'm so pleased to introduce Michelle Deitch, who will introduce our speaker, is Michelle. I've never introduced Michelle before. I've gone in her office and chit-chatted, but I've never really introduced her, so this is a great pleasure for me. Michelle is a longtime senior lecturer here at the LBJ School who teaches criminal justice and juvenile justice policy. That is an understatement of what she really does for the school and the students. She's a lawyer with a joint appointment here and at the law school, and is a member of the board of directors for the Barbara Jordan Freedom Foundation. She spent her career, even before she came to academia, working on issues related to criminal justice reform and juvenile justice reform, and her research has had major impact on efforts to improve prison and jail conditions and to remove youth from adult prisons and jails and to reduce incarceration. So when we talk about impact at the university level and we talk about what we want our students to do in terms of taking complex problems, using their imagination and going forth and do something, this woman's an exemplar of that type of work that we do here. I'm so pleased she's here. She's currently working with her students to increase transparency and accountability in the criminal justice system and to highlight the need for independent oversight of prisons, jails, and juvenile facilities all around the country. She's won numerous awards, too numerous to list. She's written in, op-eds. She's done research on behalf of the Texas legislature, and she has done a great TEDx talk. Last year on juvenile justice, also really great when we got the link and was like, oh, that's Michelle, she's doing a great job. So I'm so pleased to introduce you to Michelle, who will introduce our keynote speaker.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. Can you hear me okay? All right. It's an honor and a true pleasure to introduce Vanita Gupta as the keynote speaker for this year's Barbara Jordan Forum. When it comes to the topic for this year's forum, criminal justice reform, a common destiny, it would be hard to find a speaker who would be a more perfect fit. Vanita is a longtime civil rights lawyer, an expert on all things criminal justice, a strategic thinker, a mover and shaker, and an inspirational leader who has won the confidence of stakeholders across the political spectrum. Many of us in this audience have crossed paths with Vanita at various stages in her career, and have worked closely with her on issues that affect the lives of the most powerless, the most vulnerable, and marginalized people in this country. Vanita's entire career has given her a front row seat to the most critical criminal justice issues of our day. Working in various capacities for two of our nation's most venerable civil rights organizations, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and the ACLU, she's fought for racial justice, she's challenged mass incarceration, and she's championed the rights of immigrant detainees. In her first case as a lawyer, she fought successfully to overturn the wrongful drug convictions of 38 individuals in the small town of Tulia, Texas. If you remember the national news coverage, you will recall that 10% of the town's African-American population had been framed by the perjured testimony of a racist undercover narcotics officer, and they'd received sentences of up to hundreds of years. After winning a pardon for her clients, Vanita then obtained a $6 million legal settlement for them. What you may not know about this case is that soon after Vanita's victory, a film company bought the rights to her life. And actress Halle Berry announced that she wanted to play her, which I think is not bad for a recent law school graduate. So one of Vanita's other high-profile cases included her work on behalf of immigrant children who were detained in a private prison in Hutto, Texas, that led to the end of family detention at that facility. You may notice a theme here about civil rights issues in Texas, but we're not going to go there. In 2014, President Obama appointed Vanita to head the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division, where she represents the US government on every civil rights issue, from voting rights to police brutality, to disability rights, to litigation over conditions in prisons and jails. The cases in which she's involved have truly been ripped from the headlines. She's in charge of the investigations and lawsuits about police shootings in Ferguson and Baltimore, about the Chicago Police Department, about horrific jail conditions on Rikers Island, about de facto debtors' prisons that ensnare poor people for their failure to pay fines, about court practices that trap young people in the school-to-prison pipeline, and many, many more. Vanita, we are extremely grateful to you for your vision and your leadership on all of these profoundly important civil rights issues, and we're grateful that you made time in your schedule to be here today. We know how busy you are, and we really appreciate that. So without further ado, I'll introduce you, and also thank you so much for your willingness to take questions after your talk.
It's hard to come in after an introduction like that, I have to tell you. You should just sit down and be quiet and let that stand for what it is. I've known Michelle for years. It's true I have a special affinity for Texas, clearly. Some people think that I've only litigated in Texas. That is not true, but I don't remember when we first met. It was maybe even close to 2 decades ago, but your leadership and your work on all of these issues has been such an important inspiration for the rest of us that toil away on these issues every day as well, so thank you. And I want to thank Dean Evans. I've heard so many fantastic things about you and about the LBJ School. I've spoken at the law school here at UT. I have a special place in my heart for UT because oftentimes I was going to all other parts of Texas, and I would come to Austin every now and then. I'd be like, okay, these are my people. I have lots of friends here, and there's so many friends in this room, and it's just wonderful. But Dean Evans, and I want to thank the students and faculty and staff of the LBJ School. Whenever you put one of these on, and it sounds like this is just a beautiful annual tradition, it really does take a lot of work, and I can't tell you how honored I am to be speaking to honor Barbara Jordan's legacy. She is a real American hero. She's been a hero of mine. She's a hero for so many, and it's just wonderful that you have this event every year. I also want to thank Shirley Franklin, the former mayor of Atlanta, as you said, but also now the Barbara Jordan Visiting Professor of Ethics and Political Values at the LBJ School. I followed your career as well, and it's great to be able to meet you. I hope I have a couple minutes later. So today really presents just a wonderful moment to honor the legacy of Barbara Jordan. But I think it also gives us a chance to apply the lessons of her life to the defining civil rights challenges of our time. And I would say that right now, I've been a civil rights lawyer my whole career, but there's never been a time when I've been engaged on these issues where these issues are truly occupying the center stage for the country. And in so many ways, though, the life and story of Barbara Jordan's really mirrors the story of America itself, because born into the era of Jim Crow, she felt the profound pain of racial inequality and structural inequality. But confronted really with fierce opposition, she responded with firm optimism about our nation's capacity for progress. And time and again, she chose faith over fear. She merged courage with compassion, and she preached unity over division. From the Fifth Ward of Houston to the United States Congress, Barbara Jordan taught us, taught me, taught so many of you about the power of our democracy to balance the scales of justice. And she really viewed our government as an engine for change. She called it our appointed mediator, prosecutor, defender, our means of guaranteeing our freedoms and protecting our frailties. Given the historic heights that Barbara Jordan reached in her lifetime, we obviously could spend an entire day just talking about all of her accomplishments, yet I suspect that she would prefer otherwise. I believe that Barbara Jordan would urge us together to confront injustice, to build unity, and to drive progress. And in communities around the country today, in too many communities, too many people, especially young people and people of color, hear plenty about the promise of equal opportunity, but see only the reality of inequality. They live in the face of inequality that threatens to derail their dreams for a brighter future. And each day, discrimination continues to stack the deck against them. So as we discuss the challenges in our criminal justice system, I think we also have to acknowledge the systemic inequalities that we see in other areas. Because discrimination in so many places, from the classroom to the workforce to the marketplace, perpetuate those inequalities that we see in the criminal justice system. And for those that are already living in poverty, a single incident, whether it's an arrest by a police officer or a fine by a court, can lead to a cycle of severe problems that can ruin lives and tear apart families. And as someone who focuses and spent her whole life on civil rights issues, I see these problems every day. But I also, I will say, see a country on the cusp of change. As I said, I've been working on these issues for many years now. And for a long time, I would work on these issues, and it would have to be, I was almost trying to convince civil rights groups to care about these issues, to care about what was happening in the criminal justice system, because groups on the right and the left, frankly, had made these issues kind of fringe. They weren't part of the center stage. They weren't occupying mainstream America. People were ignoring what was happening in our criminal justice system. But today, I do really see a country on the cusp of change. Last week, I was in a room with 20 civil rights leaders, the president and the attorney general, just on criminal justice reform. It was just hard to imagine that that would have been, that happened before. In fact, usually it was kind of the, occupied kind of the third rail of politics. And now we're seeing really a wide range of political perspectives, people, policymakers and officials and advocates that are really coming together to bridge divides and bring criminal justice reform into the center stage. But we have a lot of work to do. At the Department of Justice, we firmly believe that our country needs and deserves a criminal justice system that more effectively protects our communities, more fairly treats our people, and more prudently spends our resources. But we also know that transforming our criminal justice system is going to require a holistic approach. Because from our schools to our streets, too many vulnerable residents end up entering the criminal justice system, sometimes for no legitimate reason at all. And once they do, ineffective policies from our courts to our jails can leave them trapped inside for years. And throughout the Civil Rights Division and across the entire Department of Justice, we continue to address those challenges using a multifaceted approach. At the front line, we can see these challenges in our school-to-prison pipeline. Too many of our children end up in the juvenile justice system with their rights, without the rights, that our Constitution guarantees and the opportunities that they deserve. They may suffer the devastating consequences that stem from simply acting out in a classroom. And suddenly they find themselves at a detention hearing rather than at graduation. In Meridian, Mississippi, we had a case where we investigated students who'd been suspended from school, some later incarcerated in a juvenile detention facility for the most mundane behavior. It was things like dress code violations for wearing the wrong color socks, flatulent in class, yelling at teachers, leaving the class for a bathroom without permission. These actions disproportionately harm children of color and children with disabilities, and they did little to advance public safety. In response, we reached several agreements to remedy discriminatory school discipline practices in and around Meridian. And the department also reached agreements to address due process violations in school-based policing and juvenile probation. And together, these agreements seek to ensure appropriate resolution rather than escalation of school incidents. Now, of course, one issue that I came into the Justice Department about a month and a half after the events in Ferguson in August of 2014. And certainly policing and police community trust and police community relations and systemic issues involving policing have occupied much of my time at the Civil Rights Division. Eroding and fragmented trust in community police relations obviously also contributes to some of the issues that we are seeing right now play out in the criminal justice system. I think really until Ferguson, there had been a lot more focus on sentencing and some on prison conditions, but much less on kind of what was happening in the streets and daily interactions and the like in communities that had become all too familiar with those kinds of engagements. But in communities across the country right now, the Civil Rights Division continues to advance constitutional policing that builds trust between law enforcement officers and the communities that they serve. A key part of our work involves working to reform local law enforcement agencies that are engaged in a pattern or practice of constitutional violations such as excessive force or discriminatory policing. The agreements that arise from these cases, court-enforceable, independently monitored consent decrees, hold the potential really to serve as models for reform around the country. While the Civil Rights Division goes into a police department usually on a pretty significant predicate to believe that there may be unconstitutional patterns and practices, we conduct a thorough investigation, and I can speak more about this later, but we conduct thorough investigations, and then if we make findings, we then try to reach an agreement with the jurisdiction to create a consent decree in that jurisdiction to really transform policing there. And these consent decrees, combined with kind of the detailed recommendations that some of you may have seen in the President's Task Force for 21st Century Policing, can really help departments engage proactively before waiting for a critical incident, before waiting for local unrest, to engage in dialogue, in self-initiated review, in reform, long before the Justice Department needs to get involved and intervene. But over the past year and a half, I think there's no doubt that our nation has been engaged in an unprecedented and robust dialogue about the relationship between law enforcement and the communities that they serve. And as the head of the Civil Rights Division, I have met with parents who lost children in tragic officer-involved shootings, with youth who've lost faith in the justice system, and with vulnerable residents who feel humiliated in their encounters with the police. And yet in those same cities, I've also heard frustration from courageous police officers who talk about how they've become first responders to a whole set of social problems, including mental illness and school discipline. They talk about being blamed for policies that they didn't create, and who talk about the daily stress of their jobs and feeling vulnerable and attacked. Now, I have to say this because I believe it very, very much, that there is no question that the overwhelming majority of America's police officers perform their jobs with honor and distinction. They entered to the police force out of a genuine desire to serve the public, to keep our streets safe, to keep families safe from harm. But there's also no question that when police officers break the law, or departments engage in unconstitutional patterns and practices in policing, it can profoundly harm community trust, and it can profoundly undermine public safety. Last year, our report in Ferguson, of the Ferguson Police Department, made headlines for exposing a system that was really pervaded by racial bias. At nearly every stage of the system, from traffic stops to searches to arrests to the use of force, we found that Ferguson's law enforcement practices disproportionately targeted African American residents. We found that this disparate impact was driven in part by racial bias. Some city officials attributed the disparity to their belief that African Americans lacked personal responsibility, in quotes. Other city officials routinely distinguished African Americans in Ferguson from the city's normal residents, in quotes, or regular people. These were detected in emails that we uncovered. But beyond racial bias, we found another powerful and troubling dynamic at work, and that was the city's undue focus on revenue generation. We uncovered emails explicitly referring to the use of enforcement strategies to, quote, fill the revenue pipeline without due consideration for whether officers could better protect the city by focusing on neighborhood policing rather than debt collection. The amount of money that was pouring in from court fines and fees exploded in the last few years, rising from $1.4 million in 2010 to a projected more than $3 million last year. We found the city issuing multiple citations for excessive fines and fees for minor violations. Fines like $302 for jaywalking, $427 for disturbing the peace, $531 for high grass and weeds to grow on your lawn. And we found the inability of poor people, low-income individuals, to pay these fines and fees were leading to multiple arrests, jail time, payment that far exceeded the cost of the original ticket. These practices left a devastating impact on the residents of Ferguson. And in addition to the residents, I think it's important to note that we encountered Ferguson police officers who themselves expressed concern that the undue focus on law enforcement as a vehicle for revenue generation had changed what they did their job and what they had actually signed up for. One officer questioned why the police department didn't allow residents to use their limited means to actually fix broken headlights and actually benefit public safety rather than pay fines to fill the city's coffers. And as we demonstrated with our lawsuit earlier this month, the Justice Department is going to continue our vigorous enforcement efforts to ensure that Ferguson's law enforcement practices comply with the Constitution while serving the entire community and supporting public safety, because Ferguson residents and police officers deserve nothing less. But look, the reality is, and there's been a lot more attention paid to what was happening in Ferguson, but the reality is that the problem of excessive fines and fees extends well beyond Ferguson. And you can probably look in the courts in your state. In fact, the problem exists in many of the courts, 6,500 municipal courts. I don't know how many of you know, but there are 6,500 municipal courts in this country. And at a conference that was organized by the Justice Department and the White House last December, we heard court leaders express surprise and even outrage that such practices had become routine. Many jurisdictions have started to change their practices of imposing excessive fines and fees on their residents. But in the coming months, we're going to be continue to work on efforts to help other communities implement critical reforms in this area, so stay tuned. The Civil Rights Division also engages in a whole wide range of efforts to combat unlawful policies that result in the punishing of people for their poverty. And our involvement in an Idaho case last year provides an example. According to media reports, Boise resident Janet Bell became homeless more than a decade ago, and she lost part of her left arm because of an infection that nearly killed her, and she went to live on the streets. When the city began issuing multiple citations simply for camping on the street, she had no money to pay them and no other place to go. The police arrested Janet, along with several other homeless individuals, for violating Boise ordinances that criminalize sleeping or camping in public. And last summer, the Civil Rights Division, the Justice Department, filed a statement of interest in the case. And we made a very simple argument. Because every human being has to sleep at some time and somewhere, punishing a person for sleeping in public when they have nowhere else to go criminalizes homelessness. It violates the Eighth Amendment. And beyond the constitutional issues, of course, criminalizing homelessness also constitutes poor public policy. It fails to give homeless people the resources that they need to get on their feet and find stable housing. It fails to break the cycle of poverty. And the disproportionate harm that policy choices visit people in poverty also extends to our courts. When poor people with low incomes, lack adequate legal representation, too often it leads to a chain of events that traps them in the criminal justice system. More than half a century ago, after the United States Supreme Court ruled that a fair trial requires a right to counsel, we know today that too many poor defendants and low-income defendants still face enormous barriers to justice. And in too many communities, insufficient funding for indigent defense can lead to situations where even well-intentioned and capable public defenders can serve in effect as attorneys in name only. Take the story of a Syracuse resident, James Adams. He was one of the plaintiffs in a case called Hurl Herring versus State of New York. After he allegedly stole sticks of deodorant from a Rite Aid drugstore, police arrested him on charges of felony robbery and burglary. He faced up to 14 years in prison. With bail set at $2,500, which he couldn't afford, James sat in jail for more than 3 months. And according to the New York Civil Liberties Union, he never saw his attorney outside of open court. At one of his court appearances, the attorney didn't even bother to attend. We, at the Justice Department, filed a statement of interest to argue that the denial of one's Sixth Amendment right to counsel can result from a range of factors. We know that. It can result from things like lack of resources, high workloads, understaffed public defenders' offices. And just weeks after our filing, New York finally reached a comprehensive settlement agreement with the plaintiffs to implement transformative reforms to its public defense system across 5 counties in the state. In another critical area, and one that I think is getting increased attention in certain pretrial detention systems around the country, bail practices end up penalizing defendants simply because they cannot afford to pay for their release. Of course, there's no question, sometimes we have to use pretrial detention to protect the safety of our communities. But bail or bond systems that fail to account for indigence can result in one's detention based on wealth, not on valid concerns such as public safety or securing a person's appearance in court. Clanton, Alabama, resident Christy Dawn Varden, a 41-year-old mother of 2 who relied on food stamps and struggled with mental and physical health issues. After the police arrested her in a Walmart parking lot on shoplifting and other misdemeanor charges last year, she couldn't afford to pay the $2,000 in bail to get released. The court said she had to wait in jail for 1 week before seeing a judge. Shortly after she sued the city of Clanton, we filed a statement of interest in the case. We argued that using money bail to incarcerate someone solely because he or she cannot afford to pay violates the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. And earlier this year, the city of Clanton agreed to release most misdemeanor defendants without forcing them to pay bail. But there are a lot of state and local systems that need a lot of work in this area. And again, beyond the constitutional issues at stake, these troubling bail practices constitute poor public policy. Research demonstrates a compelling case regarding the impact of pretrial incarceration without regard for one's ability to pay on public safety. In addition, pretrial incarceration that results solely from one's ability to pay can have a devastating impact on other areas of one's life. It can leave ripple effects throughout struggling communities. It can cause defendants to lose their jobs, their health benefits, sometimes even their children, and they struggle to provide for their families throughout. The division is also working, and I think it's really important, and Michelle spoke to some of this, about the work in our prisons and jails. We continue to focus on the particular harms that solitary confinement and other forms of restrictive housing can cause for vulnerable populations, including prisoners with serious mental illness and juveniles. In 2014, we investigated Pennsylvania prisoners. We found that Pennsylvania prisons, we found that Pennsylvania prisoners with serious mental illness were enduring prolonged solitary confinement under harsh conditions that caused serious harm, including severe mental deterioration, psychosis, and acts of self-harm. More than 70% of documented suicide attempts over a 17-month period occurred in the system's solitary confinement units. Now imagine the scene that we discovered in Pennsylvania for prisoners with serious mental illness who were held in solitary confinement. They spent nearly their entire day in a cell about the size of an average American bathroom. It contained a thin plastic mattress on top of a metal bed frame. It had a metal sink, a metal toilet, a metal desk, and a metal seat that basically occupied the space of the cell. And some of the cells included a very tiny, small exterior-facing window, but most of them did not. Prisoners got out of cell time. 5 times per week, they got to spend 1 hour in an empty and caged outdoor pen. 3 times a week, they took a 15-minute shower. And before they could actually leave their cells, the prisoners had to first submit to being strip searched. When the prisoners got to their out-of-cell activity, corrections officers were transporting them, shackling their arms and legs together. I don't need to tell you what kind of impact something like that and these kinds of conditions could have on people with serious mental illness. Just last year, the state reached a comprehensive settlement to implement a wide range of reforms. These reforms included extended periods of time for out-of-cell time for prisoners with mental illness and improved mental health training and access for corrections staff. Last month, I hope that many of you saw this, but President Obama announced that he would adopt a series of Justice Department recommendations for reform on the use of restrictive housing or solitary confinement in our federal prison system. This really marked a critical, and I think some of you have been working on these issues for years, but it was very important that the president was able to put these imprimatur behind what I think is really nationwide change on these issues. but it marked a critical and indeed historic step in progress. The department's report concluded that corrections officers should limit their use of solitary confinement by employing it rarely, fairly, and reasonably. The president directed the federal prison system, among other measures, to end solitary confinement for juveniles, to divert inmates with serious mental illness to secure mental health units, to scale back the use of solitary confinement for disciplinary purposes, and to discourage the placement of inmates in any form of restrictive housing during the final 6 months of their prison terms. The department also, the report also sets forth 50 guiding principles or best practices that are really designed to serve as a roadmap for state and local systems around the country. Now, of course, corrections officials face dangerous and complex challenges, and we know that. And in some cases, we know that they need to be able to have the tool of restrictive housing or solitary confinement. But we have to change our approach. We have to begin to view solitary confinement as a last resort to ensure the safety of other prisoners and staff, rather than as a first response to inflict punishment, which it had become for all too many years. The stories that I'm just talking about today, I think, just really highlight a troubling trend. And on occasions when the criminal justice system ends up discriminating against people because of the color of their skin or the size of their wallet or their mental health condition, all of these things raise serious constitutional concerns, and they raise serious problems in public policy. They trap the most vulnerable among us in a cycle of perpetual inequality. They fail to advance public safety, and they can undermine the legitimacy of our justice system. I don't think that we can fix these problems working in silos. I think really real problems require holistic approaches, and you were talking, Dean, about complex problems and how to get creative and think outside of the box. I think these problems demand collaboration, and they demand that we really bridge divides in the pursuit of our common goals: equality, justice, fairness for all people, regardless of the amount of money you have or your race or your disability status. Barbara Jordan spoke passionately about the national community and spirit of harmony that binds us together. And yet, as she reminded us, as this forum I think really highlights, a spirit of harmony will survive in America only if each of us remembers, when self-interest and bitterness seem to prevail, that we share a common destiny. At the Texas State Cemetery in Austin, on the back of Barbara Jordan's headstone, we find these simple words: Teacher Jordan. From public office to private life, Barbara Jordan continued to teach. She taught us about the power of our democracy to level the playing field. And she taught us that no matter the magnitude of the task, our country can rise to the challenge, so long as we remain aware of our past, optimistic about the present, confident in the future, and I would add, vigilant and hardworking toward better conditions and better times. So today, I think, really let us not remember just the life of Barbara Jordan. I think we want to draw inspiration from her legacy as we continue to tackle the civil rights challenges of our time. And let us together seize the promise of the moment, which I really believe is an unprecedented moment, to shape our country into a land that is filled with freedom, anchored in fairness, and governed by justice for all. So thank you very much. Thank you. So I'm happy to answer some questions. Yeah.
That was terrific, brilliant. I'm a professor here at the LBJ School. I'm teaching a course on civil rights and public policy. And we're focusing on some aspects of what you talked about in terms of criminal justice, reading Michelle Alexander and Brian Stevenson and all this stuff. In terms of Ferguson, but also really nationally, what do you think moving forward, how long is this going to take in terms of people of color and really citizenship? Because what's going on vis-a-vis the criminal justice system and what happened to black folks in Ferguson, but this is happening to people of color all over, is that they're not getting access to full and equal citizenship. And we can see this through the outcomes. And I think everything you're talking about, consent decrees, this is all great. But in terms of policy, in terms of trickling down nationally, how long do you think it's going to really take? And also, because you work for DOJ, there's been different groups like the Brennan Center. They've talked about the burn grants and sort of transforming burn grants to, rather than incentivize police to arrest folks of color, but to think about using burn grants in different ways to promote rehabilitation, to promote mental health issues, drug rehabilitation, all these different things that would give these poor communities, especially disadvantaged communities of color, access to citizenship. Because just ending what went on in Ferguson still does not give these groups of people access to full and equal citizenship, which is what Barbara Jordan wants and wanted in her legacy, and what democracy, small d democracy, is really about.
So, so just to start with the first part, I mean, I think honestly, the ability to produce wide-scale reform depends on all of us. I mean, so, you know, the Civil Rights Division does the Ferguson report. In my prior life, when I'd been at the American Civil Liberties Union in 2010, we had worked on a report that documented the state of debtors' prisons in 4 states. So it wasn't suddenly that the Justice Department spoke about something. I think what we were able to do is lend the imprimatur of the federal government to an issue in a place that had drawn widespread attention, widespread protest, and really raised awareness on these issues. But I said there's 6,500 municipal courts, and the state of Texas is home to many of them. And when we do this work at the Justice Department, we hope that it will arm people, communities, advocates around the country with the kinds of tools to start conversations with judges, with, I mean, you know, and one of the issues on fines and fees I will tell you that is really tricky is in every state there are different ways that states and counties, in some places counties determine what the fines and fees are, in other states the Supreme Courts do, in other states there'll be a state legislative body. And so much, and you all know this better than I do, but so much of public policy, even to start to move public policy, requires, I think, really 2 things. One is documentation of what the actual problem is, to know who your targets are, how to break down what the anatomy of the problem is, and stories that really help move and galvanize people toward reform. And so with the Ferguson report, we're obviously working on some other things. There are things like the Brennan Center that has produced a report, the ACLU has. But I think it requires local energy and advocacy to understand how these problems are manifesting here in the state of Texas, here in this part of Texas, to understand what the structure is. And there are already probably people in this room, I'm looking at Andrea, but there are probably people in this room who know how this stuff happens and how it breaks down, and how to actually push for change. Because I think on these issues right now, there is an appetite for, among some of the key policymakers and stakeholders, to actually begin to look at their systems and see what's happening. And if they aren't, then we need to apply pressure. You need to apply pressure. Because I agree, you can focus on one jurisdiction, but to the extent that these are national problems, it requires kind of nationwide work and people to really use their advocacy to make those changes. On the burn grant and being inside, you know, it's interesting. One thing I will say, which has been remarkable, I mean, I don't think I would have joined the Justice Department if I hadn't borne witness through actual demonstration of Attorney General Eric Holder at that point, and the president was beginning to kind of come out of his shell. I think he's in his final years, and now he's feeling a little bit more liberated to speak about what's happening in the justice system, and Ferguson has obviously, in all the events since, have really brought these issues to the fore. But this is an administration that has been, certainly in the last several years, really pushing to put its money where its mouth is on these issues. And actually, there has been a lot of work in the last 2 years on burn jag reform and trying to build in performance metrics for police departments to actually report diversion and other things that are going to create different sets of incentives for when the federal government is giving out money. And so that's where, you know, burn grants, which go out to almost every jurisdiction in the country, it's not a particularly sexy area. It's not as, you know, interesting as kind of an enforcement case, but it actually can have tremendous impact. And there has been a lot of work done at the Justice Department to try to start to reorient the ways in which you know, DOJ can, through the bully pulpit, but also through funding, try to reorient some of the priorities that we've had for so long in this country.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you. My name is Reginald Smith. I'm a student at the social work school here at UT. Louisiana has the highest incarceration rate, and they also use fines and fees in order to give the budgets to the public defender's offices. So in Orleans Parish, the chief public defender just recently said that he has to stop taking cases because they no longer have money to fund his office. So with most of these criminal cases are settled by plea bargain, pursuant to plea bargain. So what do you think should be done in order to ensure that these people get the constitutional representation that they should get?
Yeah, and for those of you who haven't read it, Derwin Bunton, who is the chief public defender in New Orleans, published an op-ed in the New York Times earlier this week, I think it was a few days ago, talking about this problem. And I will say it's been a long-standing problem in the state of Louisiana. I also know the American Civil Liberties Union, I think recently, filed a lawsuit to challenge the fine structure for public defenders. And so I can't get into it too much because that whole case may be brought to our attention soon enough. But I think that there is a real opportunity. It's a very entrenched system in Louisiana. Public defender offices have long been funded by court tickets and fines and fees. And in this case, I think Derwin Bunton is demonstrating, and his office is demonstrating a lot of leadership and has been sued by the American Civil Liberties Union. And I think he's saying, we're admitting that all of these things are problematic. And of course, there's a question of political will and how much pressure will be brought to bear. I think there could be there's policy work, but it may require some pressure through litigation, and we'll see how all of that unfolds. I unfortunately can't speak too much to that, just in case that we're asked to join in, but I think that that's an example of a problem that many of us have known about for many, many years, but which may actually have its time right now, given the focus on these issues.